The plains of Abraham.
Yeah.
It's taking a long time. Quebec City actually. Yeah. Before we start, just a reminder that the workshop in front of us today is in the afternoon. Maybe overlap. We might be encouraged to try to talk about stuff that has to be closed. Remember that closed the one, so we can save some questions for those. If we start getting the discussions, we stay out. Special protection. We have great lunch. We have it. Okay.
Oh, it's not 9 o'clock yet. It's not 9 o'clock yet. But I thought you said I have to wait till 9.
You do?
Well, then. Don't pressure me. All right, we're good. Good morning, everybody. It is Tuesday, January 24th. The time is 9 a.m. and welcome to our council workshop. As we have quorum, I'll call the meeting to order. I would first like to recognize that the city of Maple Ridge carries out its business under traditional. First name. That was you? Just trying to steal my thunder, aren't you? Can I get a motion to approve the agenda, please? Moved by Councillor Youssef and seconded by Councillor Schiller. All those in favor? Unanimous. Motion is passed.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, could we just slow down for one moment while I record those votes?
Okay.
It's Councillor Youssef and Councillor
Schiller.
Schiller. Thank you. There we go. Okay.
Need a motion for the minutes, right?
Yes, the next item is the adoption of minutes.
Okay. Can I get a motion to approve the minutes? Moved by Councillor Doze, seconded by Councillor Duick. All those in favor? Motion has passed unanimously.
Thank you.
So we have no presentations at the request of council and no unfinished and new business. We're going to move on to 5.1.
Item 5.1 is Maple Ridge Housing Policy Background Report. We've got a staff report providing a summary compilation of the significant body of work that has been undertaken on housing initiatives since endorsement of the Housing Action Plan in 2014, including review and expansion of rental housing and infill housing regulations, financial measures, and initiatives that are in the 2023 business plan. We have Mr. Goddard here for a presentation.
I'm just going to do the introduction to our senior planner, who is Amanda Grokowicz. She's our specialist in housing issues. So this is a presentation to get council some footing on where we've been in the past and where our housing policies lie in our current legislation and bylaws. Of course, they exist in our OCP primarily first, and then council has done different work on our housing action plan, which was done in 2014, implementation framework for housing in 2015. And the latest work was our housing needs assessment report, which is required by the province. That was completed last year, 2021. And this is, of course, ongoing work, and we're looking forward to council's new desires and goals for the next few years. Through your work, and Amanda will come up to give you the details of this work. Thank you.
Good morning, Mayor and Council. Perfect. So this morning we'll be running through a number of housing policy initiatives that we've been looking at over the last couple of years. But first off, I just wanted to take a moment to go over how this report was really intended to be used. It's a summary report. It's intended to be a reference document. Each section contains dates and links to more information on the various topics that you can explore at your leisure if there's anything in particular that you're looking for that isn't covered in the report or the presentation today. The first part of the presentation, we're going to be looking at that housing policy framework, as Chuck mentioned. So we're going to be doing high-level policy work and then some really brief snapshots of what these housing initiatives look like on the ground, and where appropriate, we'll be identifying where the work is planned for 2023 or is currently underway. Following that, there'll be a bit of a discussion about other elements or other initiatives that are impacting the creation or encouragement of housing in the community. And at the end, following any question and answers, we're inviting council to comment on the initiatives in the report, as well as where you would like to see additional information as it relates to housing elements and housing pieces of work going forward. So first off is our official community plan. So this document reflects the community's long-term vision. We've included a copy of Chapter 3, the Neighborhood and Housing chapter, as an appendix to the report, as it includes all principles, goals, and policies that relate to advancing housing in Maple Ridge. It is important to note that the city's journey into housing policy, particularly in the areas of affordable and rental housing, began prior to the adoption of this OCP. As early as 1999, when we brought in our secondary suite regulations, the city was considered a leader in promoting housing choice in the region. So again, the OCP reflects the shared community values of Maple Ridge residents and provides an overarching housing framework for the city, which leads us to the Housing Action Plan and the implementation framework. So again, 2014 for the Housing Action Plan, 2015 for the implementation framework. Between these two documents, they implement recommendations and actions that directly activate the OCP policies. These documents are used as the framework for housing in Maple Ridge, as well as for the structure of the report before you and then this morning's presentation. We'll be coming back to the Housing Action Plan and that framework in just a moment. I would just like to touch on the Housing Needs Assessment and the Housing Needs Report. So as mentioned, this was introduced as a requirement by the province in 2019. The intent of this work was intended to strengthen the ability of local governments and council to understand what kinds of housing are most needed in their community. In terms of Maple Ridge, we conducted this work over 2020 and presented the results to council in 2021. Overall, the findings reaffirmed the policy direction outlined in the OCP and the Housing Action Plan, namely that we are growing older, that we need more family-friendly units, that we need more rental, and that we are having a growing disconnect between what is available and what is affordable. So coming back to the Housing Action Plan, this document contains principles, visions, goals in terms of housing for the community, as well as setting out 18 strategies, which are grouped under 4 categories. These are the 18 strategies, and the ones in red are the ones that are covered in the report and the presentation this morning. So what all these strategies translate to is really the city's housing policy areas of work that have taken place. So these are our snapshots. We're going to be doing quick high-level overviews of these pieces. and we'll be going through them in the order that is in the report as well as on the screen before you. So first up is our mix of housing forms. Sorry. So the intent of this strategy was to ensure that new residential infill development that it takes place in our established residential neighborhoods is incremental and sensitive to our existing and emerging contexts. So what this means is we were trying to sensitively incorporate density, additional units into our existing neighborhoods. So one piece of work that took place was looking at incorporating 3, 4, and up to 8 units on one lot. So that's covered under our triplex, fourplex, and courtyard housing forms. This one in particular is intended to look like a single family home. So they're going to be a bit bulkier than your traditional single family home, but they're still supposed to have that character and they're still supposed to be compatible with the existing residential neighborhood. So as you can see, the zone came into effect in 2019 and the DP guidelines followed in 2020. On a similar note, we brought in the R4 zone in 2020, 2021. This one is intended to offer increased flexibility in terms of subdivision in particular areas within the community. It was really trying to fill that missing middle in terms of what we were permitting through subdivision. So it was just expanding our subdivision options for the community. And lastly, for the RS1 single detached zone, RS1 is our really traditional single family zone. And beginning in 2022, we were undertaking a review of other ways of exploring gentle density through this zone. There's a public consultation process that went out in 2022, and the outcomes of which will be anticipated back before council later this year. So stay tuned for more information on that one. Next up was creating new rental housing opportunities. This slide and this section of the report was really intended to show how the narrative kind of came and then broke into 2 parts. There's definitions, there's background material in your report. Really, that's where the crux of this particular piece is. So I encourage you to take a look if this is one of those areas that is of particular interest. As most of the work items since 2016 have been captured under the secondary suite and detached garden suite work, which we are looking at next. So on the screen before you, this is a summary of what we permit today for both secondary suites and detached garden suites. Essentially, depending on your zone, you can have one of each, but not both. And both are intended to remain secondary or accessory to the primary single family dwelling on the lot. Recently, council removed the owner occupancy requirements, so both the principal unit as well as the secondary suite or DGS may be rented out. And we do have a number of regulatory pieces of work underway that were directed in 2022 and will be back before you in 2023. Particular note, we'll be releasing a public engagement process in the very near future that is looking at ways to permit secondary suites potentially in the R2, R3, and the duplex zone, known as R1. So again, keep an eye out for that as that'll be going out to the community later on in Q1. The next section in the housing action plan in terms of general strategies looked at tenant relocation. So in 2018, following council direction, staff put together a policy that was really focused on tenant relocation assistance, and at the same time reviewed the existing modular home park redevelopment tenant assistance policy. So through this work, they established a set of requirements that future applicants would need to follow. The policies are again linked in the report, but essentially we're looking at right of first refusal for tenants of these properties, including such requirements as having another 3 places where they would be able to potentially move to, as well as requiring a minimum of 2 months notice post final reading and adoption by council. In the same general theme, we have our non-market housing opportunities. So between 2019 and 2021, staff did a significant amount of work looking at ways to permit and regulate supportive recovery housing in single detached neighborhoods in Maple Ridge. Essentially, we're looking at a density bonus option where interested applicants are able to bonus up to 10 residents or 10 individuals on the property for this use. And then the report also includes a high-level review of some of the more recent development applications that have fallen under the non-market housing umbrella for you to see what has come before council over the last couple of years. Next up, financial measures. So this piece of work, or this strategy, sorry, is largely broken into 2 components: community amenity contributions and density bonus. On the one hand, they appear very similar, but they are enacted very differently under legislation. So community amenity contributions are voluntary contributions provided by the developer at time of rezoning, whereas density bonus or a more traditional transfer of density or more units for cash. So the city's community amenity contribution has been in place since 2016. We've updated it from time to time. And as you can see, the most recent rate targets are on the screen before you. We are currently in the middle column, and then later on this year, we'll be moving up to the third column on the right. And then within what is proposed in the planning department's work plan for 2023 will be a comprehensive review of both the CAC program and the density bonus program in order to make sure that they integrate and reflect the current market trends. In terms of density bonusing, in 2019, council directed a zone amending bylaw come into effect that essentially established the rates on the screen for size. So prior to 2018, when this work began, rental units were being negotiated as a component of some rental or market strata projects. However, after 2019, the requirement was, and it is, and still is, to provide a financial contribution in lieu of the rental units. The funds received through this stream do go into an affordable housing fund, which can then be used to fund other or future affordable housing projects in the city. Last strategy I just want to briefly touch on is the establishment of local advisory groups. So following the endorsement of the implementation framework in 2015, the city did reestablish the joint meetings that had been taking place between the city and the local development industry over the last couple of decades. In the current iteration, we have representatives from our local development community, including the Urban Development Institute and the Home Builders Association of Vancouver. They currently meet quarterly to receive updates and to provide feedback on city's initiatives. And where appropriate, we also send this information to the council committees. That wraps up our very quick high-level view of housing policy in the city of Maple Ridge. And now we're going to take a really quick look at some of the other elements that are impacting the delivery of housing in our community. So it's a lot of information. Does anyone have questions now? Is that what you're asking? Questions now before we go started?
I think it might be a good idea because it sounds like we have a lot of information. So maybe after each section, we can open up for questions. So we're retaining that information. So
housing policy questions.
I'll take speakers list. Councillor Schiller, followed by Councillor Youssef, followed by Councillor Tan.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. Okay, so I'm going to start off with some very basic questions about housing because
Perfect.
That's where I'm at. So in reading through some of the information, there was some very good data in there, sort of about the amount of units of housing that we have in the community. There was some talk about projected population growth and sort of the number of units that we would anticipate would be needed. And that was just very helpful to me because it sort of gave me an idea of, the number of units that we'd be looking at moving forward over the next few years. So I'm just going to have to ask you to just explain to me, when we talk about these population figures and Maple Ridge maxing out at a certain number, 100,000, 120,000. Can you just sort of explain to me like the basis for where those numbers come from? And maybe some thoughts around, advantages to either being like trying to really aggressively meet those targets or not choosing maybe not to move as aggressively and not provide that number of units that would be anticipated for that population growth.
It's not a basic question. Okay. So there's a couple of elements that we're going to unpack. So the numbers that were included in the council report under table 4, these are really outlining what has come before council since 2016 and to illustrate what type of housing forms that we've been permitting in the last couple of years. When you're looking at the housing needs report today, and this is one of those sections that we'll get to, so apologies if there's a bit of repetition. The housing needs report was conducted on 2016 census data. The information that fed into that report was helpfully provided by Metro Vancouver. So they have a couple of algorithms that they use and employ over all of the communities so that we do have a consistent methodology in terms of what we're running for. So they've identified a number that they think is realistic based on their data. And then the housing needs report kind of breaks down what that looks like in a more more local level. However, there is a caveat in the housing needs report that it does very much depend on council policy. So while any council may decide to bring forward the number of units as an entire whole, let's just say for argument's sake, 1,000, it's up to the council to decide how many they want to be apartment, townhouses, single family, et cetera. So there's always this bit of give and take between council policies of the day, as well as the kind of constantly moving targets that we are provided both from Metro Vancouver that are still largely based on the census data. Without giving too much ahead, we are hoping to go through and do an interim update on that housing needs report because we now have the 2021 census data. This will give us a really good idea of how many units we have, what type of bedrooms we have, and then to be able to adjust and should council wish, be able to adopt targets either for the community as a whole or for particularly sized development applications. So these are some of the conversations that council can have. But kind of back to your base question as to where these targets and population estimates come from, we rely on the experts for data analysis. So the town center certainly comes with some targets that were based on work done originally, but every couple of years we are redoing them to make sure we're still on target. Is it still realistic? Have there been any regional trends that is, pushing it one way or another? And for the most part, I would say they're all still on trend. The exact year when everything will come to manifest is going to be, of course, dependent on market forces and council development applications. Does that help?
Thank you, Amanda. And I just want to acknowledge the obviously huge amount of work that's been done on this over the years. And it's great to have it all presented to us, even though, of course, it'll take a while for us to digest it all. Can I just follow up with a couple of specific
Go ahead.
questions? Just going back to those sort of the number of units that was housing units in the community that was discussed. There was sort of about maybe 1,000 units that seemed to be vacant. There was more units than were occupied, if I read that correctly. I was just sort of wondering if those units were vacant and sort of if there was anything that the city could be doing to make better uses of those properties.
So the wording that the census uses isn't necessarily to suggest that they're vacant. It's occupied by regular resident. So that is someone who lives there on a regular basis.
Mm-hmm.
The number that isn't captured by regular resident could be a renter, visitor, short-term rental.
Mm.
They leave it open to capture all these other possibilities. So it isn't to say that those properties don't have someone in it. It's just not occupied by the person who resides there on a regular basis per Census Canada's terms.
Great. Okay. Thank you. And actually, I'll save my other questions for later. Thank you.
Councillor Youssef.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to staff for the extensive body of work that's gone into this over the years. I have 3 points through the chair to make. When we're looking at the policies, for example, and I see that some of them have been completed and some of them there's more information to come. So I'm looking at table number 1, item number 2, development of alternate compliance methods for alterations to existing buildings to add a secondary suite in the BC Building Code. When looking at that, Mr. Chair, I'm hoping that the information to come and as we develop our policy forward, we take a stance of incentivizing and reducing the barriers, be it financial or regulatory, to do this kind of work, especially when it comes to alterations, as excuse me, as we're seeing that there is more regional as well as provincial and federal funds that are being made available to homeowners to retrofit their existing buildings to make them not only more energy efficient, but to make them more livable for a longer number of years. So when we take that sort of mentality to develop what's already existing, or I should say, elongate the life of and make the existing buildings that we have in our community more usable for longer, I believe that will help alleviate some of the pressures of housing. I use the real life example of the previously existing, now dissolved Ridge Meadows Ukrainian Welcoming Committee. I was a member of the committee, and when we reached out to community members to accommodate Ukrainians that were coming in, of course, our regulations and our requirements were significantly less than those that would be from the city to allow the same number of occupants to live within the space. And it was surprising the number of spaces we were able to find and the number of families we were able to house within our community. And we also have a housing crisis. So this is why I'm trying to reconcile the two, if you will. The second point is when we're talking about secondary suites in ALR, that's a piece of policy work that I've always been supportive of. And I encourage staff to look into that and to, again, ease the regulatory barriers on that front so we can accommodate, because we do have a significant amount of our lands within Maple Ridge that still is considered agriculture and within the ALR. So again, trying to do our part policy wise to alleviate what pressures there are in the housing market. My last point, Mr. Chair, and I'm cognizant of the time. Good, do have time. For pre-approved building plan templates for detached garden suites, for example, I would like us to consider taking that a step further to pre-approved building plans for neighborhoods. I believe that would help us develop not only area plans for neighborhoods in areas that don't have existing area plans. And so we're getting these applications and sort of patchwork of density and building types that fit within the zoning, but may not fit within the neighborhood character. So that's one issue that I'm trying to overcome with this. And it would also expedite the building and development process, because if I come in and I purchase a property in this neighborhood, knowing that there's a pre-approved building template, I know what type of house I'm going to be building, how many people I can house in it, and what it will cost for the most part. So it provides a faster process to get housing on the market, and also for the investor, if you will, or for the end user, the owner, the applicant, it would provide a more predictable housing application and process, and allow us to deliver that again in a quicker manner. I use the example, or I've looked into the example of the city of Kelowna that have done this in their downtown core. I unfortunately don't see Ms. Carter in the room, as her and I had that discussion and exchanged some of the ideas on it. And I'm sure she would be able to provide more of a technical viewpoint on it. I wonder if Mr. Goddard would have anything to add or to point out.
Mr. Hartman.
Thank you, Worship. The purpose of today, I don't want to get into a full debate on housing. The purpose of today is really to inform council as we move through strategic planning. So with respect to where we're looking at Kelowna, staff are looking at some options that they'll propose at a later date with council. So today, again, is as we go through strategic planning, and we're revisiting this next week, we want to have, this is part of that onboarding piece when we look at getting you to a baseline of understanding of where we've been with housing. And Councillor Youssef and Councillor Dueck, who have been at the table for 4 years, have a great deal of insight and knowledge around some other areas. And so this will form a future conversation. So not to get too far into the weeds today. And I know where Councillor Youssef is going with this, and our planning department are looking at some alternative options with this. But today is really just about the baseline level. And so we can form a future conversation down the road. So I don't want to prejudge a conversation that we're going to be having in the future, but really just to start setting the tone, the baseline, as we start getting into our strategic planning work and refining those details so staff can flesh out a full work plan where the initiatives or case studies like Kelowna can have a more fulsome conversation, and staff are better prepared to present those findings and have that conversation around the horseshoe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hartman, and my apologies to my colleagues and staff around the table. I didn't mean to jump the gun. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councillor Chan.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. To no one's surprise, I am delighted that we are having this conversation today. Please, staff, but feel free to give me a 500-page report anytime on housing policy. This is my jam. Love it. Some points and also questions to the chair, to staff. Thank you, Councillor Schiller, for your thoughts on the population growth. And I think that, and like, I think from the overwhelming concern that we're seeing around affordable housing in this around here, I think that I'm confident that the data so far has shown that we urgently need housing all along the continuum, and at this point, like it is all urgently needed, to Councillor Youssef's point, that we have a housing crisis, and that anything we can do to expedite that is fantastic. And I'm thinking here, as I was reading through this report, I'm thinking like, what are the major levers we can pull here that's not playing around the margins, but what are the major levers we can pull to really increase the amount of affordable housing we have in our region, both market and also non-market housing? And so when I look at this, and so a few pieces that really jumped out at me, is I really want to signal that I think like I as a councillor have an interest in seeing what we can do to really leverage that. And I'm curious about some things that are in this report here. Density bonusing. I'm also curious about inclusionary zoning. I think the city of Burnaby has been a real leader around inclusionary zoning, and like ensuring that with each development that goes in, that the community sees a real benefit in the terms of non-market housing. So I think, my first question to staff through the chair, if I could, is whether that has been looked at, this sort of inclusionary zoning, and what can be done here, and how we can have a Made in Maple Ridge model.
Through the chair, excellent question. Inclusionary zoning came up, I want to say, in 2016. It was offered to the council of the day, but through the prioritization process, it wasn't the ones that were moved forward at that time. It is certainly included in the housing action plan as well as the strategy, so it is certainly something that can be looked at further.
Good.
Can I keep going?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. All right. The other thing, I was curious about affordability covenants. So I think there's one from what I've seen so far, I think one large pressure on our housing system is the desire and the way our financial system is set up to use houses for profit instead of houses for people. And I think that's that's one of the major pressures putting on our housing system. So I'm curious about things like affordability covenants. I'm curious about the RT2 zoning that you talked about with the 3-plex, 4-plex, and the courtyard. One, I'm curious if 6-plex has a few questions around that. One, how much impact we have seen around that? Have we considered 6-plexes in that? And third, the city of Vancouver was also talking about affordability covenants with I think the 5th or the 6th unit there, so that there would be only a certain folks of a certain income level, lower than a certain income level, would be able to take up those units and also preserve those units for affordability. Could staff speak to that through the chair?
So through the chair, the RT2 form has received quite a bit of interest. Lots of questions, lots of inquiries about what it can look like. We do have a number progressing through the development application process, and I believe we have one constructed and one with building permits issued. So it is still a very new form for the community. We don't have a lot already out there. I would make a note that the courtyard housing form permits up to 8, so 6 is certainly included. It's the triplex, 4-plex that are limited by a 3 and 4 amount of units, but of course the courtyard housing can be any combination thereof. I have to say most courtyards on a certain type of urban infill lot have been coming out closer to 6, mainly in terms of site design, making sure that there's enough space for everything on the ground. We've had a couple looking at 8, but 6 seems to be the most comfortable for many neighborhoods. So in terms of permitting 6 units on a lot, we do have at least one option for that. I do know Vancouver has also been looking at the concept of, say, duplexes with suites and DGSs. So one component of that is going to be folded into that public consultation process that will be taking place in 2023. So you'll be able to hear from the community on that particular component. And I think that will help inform your conversation further on whether or not you're going to be looking at alternative options to permit 6 units on a single family lot. Of course, if you wanted to build a small apartment building, that also permits 6 units. But when we're talking about that residential or sensitive infill, those are the two kind of most common ways of bringing that number of units onto the lot. And then to your affordability covenant comment, I think that's something that we'd really need to take back and look into. There's a couple of elements that I just think we would need a legal opinion on, as well as what kind of proposed changes are coming at the provincial level, just to make sure that we are giving you the most accurate and up-to-date information on that particular option.
I appreciate that. I'd be interested in that. Yeah, and that makes sense about the legal opinion. And where I'm going with that, I'm not married to that specific policy mechanism. Where I'm going with that is that I want to have the ability to reduce the investment in the units, so that there are units in our community that are not tied to investment, and that there's not that investment motivation there. I'm curious about the next thing. I'm curious about shared equity programs like the city of Langford has. Has that been looked at?
Yes and no. Through the chair, at a certain point, the planning department really just looks at the built housing form. The ownership model behind it or the financing behind it doesn't necessarily always factor in. We are open to supporting all forms of tenure that come forward. So when someone does call the city with questions about this, we're certainly happy to facilitate those questions. But when it comes down to the land use question, we're really looking at whether or not you're putting up a single family home, townhouse, apartment building. So we've had those conversations, but in terms of seeking out a particular proponent or working with a specific developer to bring that in, that has not been taking place at this point in time, but perhaps the director would like to add more.
Thank you, Amanda. Those are very good points. I mean, it certainly could be looked at if council feels that's a priority for them. We haven't done that traditionally. And it's really linked an awful lot to the density being proposed for a development. So it's pretty hard in a small development of 4 units, 5 units to implement some of those sort of things. But when you're talking hundreds of units, that's where most municipalities and cities are looking at implementing these sort of other policies around rental affordability and special needs and all that within the same project. We haven't done that here yet. Thank you.
I think and just to elaborate on where I'm going with that, I think shared equity in the sense of because home ownership is such an important vehicle for personal finances, and most of us rely on it for retirement. So I'm seeing that shared equity model of the city owning a portion and alleviating the down payment pressure on families or on purchases of home, and what it would look like for us to create a fund in order to do that would be also financially feasible for the city. So that's where I was going there, and I'll just leave it at that. And then another piece that I may be stealing from Councillor Carreras is unit mix legislation, because you've heard us at the last meeting how we I kind of want to press a tape recorder and let it play, how many 3-bedroom units do we got? How many 2-bedroom units we got? EV charging, e-bike parking, bike parking, like how do we put that into place so that we don't have to ask those questions?
Through the chair, we currently do not have a unit mix target or requirement. So that is certainly something that can be put in through either policy or regulation. So if that is a piece of work, by all means, that can be incorporated into the city's work program. We do have requirements for EV charging infrastructure as well as for bike parking. We do also have the parking bylaw that is currently open for review, and that will also be coming to council with the initial directions in the very near future. And I think that is, at this point in time, that's a document that contains most of our parking-esque requirements, whether that be for bikes, cars, etc. So I think that's where that home would be, but I do have to say we are currently looking at best practices in terms of what types of requirements can be put forward into that document.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Councillor Carreras.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the report. And I also appreciate that housing is a massive amount of work for our community. And this report really only just touches the surface. So I know there's a ton of stuff behind this that we're all just learning about. Most of us are just all learning about is new to the table. A couple of questions. One is around on page 17 of the staff report, establish local advisory groups. My understanding of advisory groups is there's sort of a two-way piece. They're a way to advise policy development with amongst the city. And then there's also that this is what we've done. How does that work? So my question is around these advisory groups. It looks like we're only sort of communicating with the UDI and Havan, which are predominantly developers. Do we ever talk to nonprofits? A lot of the housing that I think is missing in our community, the nonprofits are taking a step up and really having a big piece of that. Do we ever invite nonprofits or housing advocates or just the general public? Is there an advisory piece that is a little more inclusive around housing in our community?
So the council committees change over time. Currently, we do have a seniors housing task force. So initiatives that relate to housing would be brought to that task force. And similarly, in the past, we've certainly brought things to SPAC and Mackey, agriculture when it pertains to the ALR, environment as well. So when possible or when deemed most appropriate, we do bring the work to our committees. And most of our housing initiatives also include a public engagement process, which of course includes your traditional open house, online surveys, et cetera, but also often includes focus groups that are targeted on specific sectors of the housing industry. So we'll have one with particular developers who build that type of housing, as well as housing providers who provide that type of housing. So throughout the overall process, we certainly attempt to be inclusive and bring everyone to the table, but depending on the initiative, there are some nuances as to how that is done.
Okay, thanks. I mean, for me to be able to make good decisions around, especially around policy, I deem a lot of importance on community and hearing from those that either have lived experience or have a knowledge in the area. And so I will always look for those ways to hear from the community. Just quickly, I just want to echo Councillor Tan on the 3-bedroom piece. And you go down to table 4. I'm sorry, I don't know the page number where table 4 is right now. It's near the bottom.
19.
Thank you. Sorry, I try to add page numbers to help everybody joining us today. It does talk about single family, duplex, triplex, townhouse, and apartments. Predominantly single family to townhouses or 3+ bedrooms. Apartments, of course, can vary to 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. Our housing needs report, and thank you acknowledging that we are looking at an interim review of this because the 2021 census data is different than 2016 and it's more current. But where, again, it's the breakdown of the 1, the 2, and the 3, and our housing needs report does identify a gap in our community on 3-bedroom apartments. And I'm just not sure how we're going to meet that need if we don't have policy to help guide us to meet that need. And so that's sort of where I struggle now is where does that policy fit? And is there a size? And I think it goes to what was just mentioned earlier around size of buildings. We've just had 2 significantly projects come before us that are of a large size. So they're not the 10, 20 unit. These are big 500 units, and that's a good opportunity. So what is a good, for me, I'm looking at how do we develop policy that's a building of a certain size needs to have a percentage of 3 to 1. And things like, does it need to include childcare if it's of a certain size? These are policies I look at. And I'm curious, are there other cities that have great innovative policies like that you've seen?
Mm-hmm. So the first part of my answer is going to speak to both elements in terms of how do you ask for this. So when you do have a development application in front of you, or if we're bringing down a policy piece of work, that first touch point is really important for you to outlay like everything that you want. We may not be able to deliver it, or we'll be able to bring forward a pro and con list, and then you'll be able to make a decision as to whether or not that is still the best fit based on any new information. But the earliest that you can bring that up to us, either in terms of we would like all development applications to consider this or respond to this, we'll be able to then translate that message to our file managers and be able to facilitate those conversations. Specifically on the housing targets, what first comes to mind is I think we do need to run that housing needs report update. It'll give us a good idea in terms of, because I appreciate the table in the report is really at housing form as opposed to unit breakdown, which is what the housing needs report's looking at. So we kind of need to bring those two pieces together, get a really good idea of what we have. It's still going to be a tiny bit dated. We're still going to be dealing at 2021, 2022, because of course things are in stream and everything constantly changes. But I would say if we can complete that piece of work, and if council is able to direct via recommendation or through the business plan that we are looking at housing targets, staff would bring that back and we would then come forward with an options report outlining summary of, generally speaking, we do a municipal scan of all of our regional partners as well as any neighborhood that is kind of considered to be of best comparison to the city of Maple Ridge. So we'll give you a really high level of what everybody else is doing in that vein, and then offer up a couple of options for council to consider. You would of course have debate and then ideally direct us to do one or the other. We would then bring down that draft policy under that option, and then you would be able to endorse or enact depending on the type of document it is.
Thank you. I love policy. Lives on past me. Thank you. I have a couple other things, but I think they're just little things that we'll get through as we get through the day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Seeing as how just before we move on, I do have a question as well. In your presentation, there was a section where there were developers can pay a fee in lieu of rents, and then that money would go to a different category. Do we have any information on that? Do we have anything where we can come back to us with the results of that? Like, has that worked? Have we actually been putting money aside?
I appreciate it's not in this report, but one of the links to our last community amenity contribution report, I believe it's from May, does have a summary. It's dated to that point in time, but it does identify how many CACs we've collected to date, how many have been allocated or intended to be used, and then how much of it is available for a future project. And then I do believe we also have estimates for the density bonus number at that point in time. But of course, if you'd like a snapshot in terms of December 2022, we would have to go back and pull those numbers. I don't believe we've used the density bonus funds, but I believe Trevor will be able to provide more information.
Just to add to that, what I think is important is to understand how many units have we given away in lieu for cash. What is that number looking like? What kind of an impact did it actually have? So in order for us to determine, do we need to change this policy? Do we need to move forward? Whatever that is, I think that's a piece of information that we're going to need. But go ahead, Trevor.
Thank you. Just dollars and cents wise, it's about $1.2 million collected by the end of the year. And it hasn't, that's life to date. It hasn't been spent on any project yet.
Thank you. Okay. Very quickly, because we're going to move on to the next section, but go ahead.
I've got a whole bunch more on my list, Mr. Mayor. When's a good time to ask them?
Well, why don't we, is it pertinent to the first part of the presentation?
To the policy areas, but I'm happy to wait till the end if that's better.
Well, let's go through the next piece right here so we don't lose track, and then you'll be first on the next speaker's list. Thank you for your efficiency.
So continuing on. May have already said this, apologies if I did. So the province recently proposed and brought in a number of changes to legislation in response to the housing affordability challenges. So the first one on the list is the Bill 26. We are anticipated to bring back a report to you on these details in the very near future. At a very high level, it was looking at amendments to how public hearings are hosted, as well as possible delegation of particular authorities, primarily in the area of development variance permits. But again, that will be a comprehensive report in and of itself, and you should have it within the next couple of weeks. Bill 44 and Bill 43 will come back before you as well. The caveat is it will come back once we have the so Bill 43 is going to be enacted by regulation in 2023. We will bring down that update report once we have an idea of what that regulation looks like in order to be able to outline those changes at the strata level, as well as how housing construction in our community may be impacted. Under the Housing Supply Act, there is also that conversation about housing targets as well. So if we, depending what comes down first, we will be folding in the housing needs report update into this conversation. And just as a heads up, there were 2 announcements last week in terms of rental protection fund and the permitting strategy for housing. Still looking for information on these. And once we have that information, it will of course be brought down to council in the most appropriate venue at that time. So taking another look at Maple Ridge, we've kind of had a bit of a good conversation about this. This is really just highlighting we'd like to take a closer look at the numbers, update the stats that we can, and then have further conversation about what type of direction or implication this may have for housing policy in Maple Ridge. The last thing that we'll be going over this morning is just the acknowledgement that we do have 2 function reviews underway at the city. First one is the building permit review, which began in 2021. This has been identified solely because it is looking at issuing permits as efficiently and quickly as possible. And this is certainly one element that does impact the creation and encouragement of housing in the community. The second piece of work began in 2022. The city has engaged a local government consultant to look at how we are reviewing development applications. And this report and recommended implementation will be coming before you shortly in the first quarter. So with that, that concludes our overall overview of background housing policy for Maple Ridge. Happy to open the floor again to any questions. And the recommendation in the report was, of course, for information, but should council wish to direct anything, you can certainly add a recommendation to the floor this morning. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Councillor Tan.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'm curious about the prioritization and staff recommendations of how we could do this, prioritizing non-market housing and making sure that getting those through our process faster, recognizing that non-market housing is valuable and of importance to folks who are currently experiencing homelessness now, and also to many members of our community all across the board. So I'm curious about things that we've looked at, such as fee reductions, municipal fee reductions, prioritizing those for review quicker. If you can speak to that through the chair.
Through the chair, over the last couple of years, we've had these conversations on a more ad hoc basis. When a particular type of development or a particular type of inquiry comes in, we've certainly discussed it. I don't believe at this point in time we do have a fast tracking or a development application process in place. However, given the fact that we do have some development function reviews underway, I would really hold off any comment on that until we have the outcomes of those reports. And depending how that's incorporated, it's something that I think we could look at that time.
Go ahead, Mr. Goddard.
I would just like to add, councils have in the past set priorities of certain things. For example, we had town center policies that were designed to encourage residential development during times, commercial development at times. So council could certainly set those goals and commitments by giving direction to staff and having it indicated as a work item within, and then we'll go away and set a criteria and all sorts of policy work around it that you can consider for making that sort of a decision. So council can set those sorts of goals and we'll help you to do that.
And to keep going, I just want to follow up on the mayor's point about the density bonusing program there with the option for developers to put instead of creating rental units, we put that in the fund. I'm really curious to look into that and really see like the pros and cons of that decision. So when staff have information on that, I just wanted to add a +1 to that of my interest. And I'm also curious about, I guess maybe a similar comment will be prioritizing applications in the downtown core, recognizing that we need to, in this day and age, prioritize transit-oriented development and recognizing that that's where the transit services are in our community. Maybe any comments on what we can do to facilitate that?
I think I will stick to my previous answer of outcome of the development application services review.
Okay, thank you. The other curiosity I have is around the residential tenant relocation policies. I know that I take inspiration for this from the city of Burnaby and how they have fairly stringent residential tenant relocation policies. I know that for those ones, they're to my understanding, and staff can please correct me if I'm wrong, that when tenants are have to be moved because their building is being demolished, they are then moved into a different location. The developer finds them that location. The developer tops up any rent that is above the rent that they originally paid. The tenant then gets right of first refusal to move back into the building, and then and even after they get moved back in the building, they then pay the same rent that they were paying before the new building was created, which to me is which would mitigate the issue of tenants experiencing like what we've seen, like fairly astronomical jumps in your rent. And I'm curious if there is respecting that I haven't been around the council discussions around the past that this sort of thing may have been discussed. Curious if there's been discussion on increasing the sort of strength of our residential tenant relocation policy.
Through the chair, there's certainly been conversations at the policy table in terms of tenant relocation, but in terms of council direction to take a look at that policy, I don't believe we've received any since 2018. So it is certainly something that we can take a look at and see how it compares with our municipal comparisons. The one note I would have is the Burnaby program is certainly the gold standard in terms of what you'd be able to provide to the tenant relocation. I would just note that some of these programs do have trade-offs in terms of the amount of density that is required to make it viable. And that's part of that conversation that has come before council. So if directed, we're happy to take a closer look, do a bit of a municipal scan and identify where some tweaks may be possible given the current market today.
I appreciate that's really that's helpful, and that makes sense to me about that there are trade-offs with that policy. And I think I'm also echoing something Councillor Carrera said last about commercial tenant relocation. I think that as many of our buildings are becoming older and there may be incentive or a desire to replace them. I think my sense is that we'll see more and more of that in our community of sort of mom and pop stores having to face relocation. And I'm just curious about, I'm not sure if I saw them in the report. If if it was in the report, please excuse me. Could you speak a little bit to that?
For the
commercial tenant relocation.
It wasn't included in the report since we were focusing on housing. Do we have a commercial? No, I don't believe we have one. So that is certainly something that we can take a look at and bring more information back under the tenant relocation piece.
Thank you. And my last one, to the relief of everyone around this table, is short-term rentals regulation. I'm curious if that has been an issue for our community and what staff are seeing about that.
We've had a couple of conversations about short-term rental accommodations, and I believe the last report was on September 27, 2022. So the link hasn't been provided in the council report at this point in time, but it is available on the website, and it does give direction for staff to take a closer look at this piece of work. So it will also be going out to the public in the very near future, and that outcomes report will be coming back before council, I believe, later in 2023.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. We're going to move on to Councillor Dewick.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I appreciate everybody's comments and questions and really appreciate the report. As everyone has noted, it's a lot of information. It spans over many councils, and I think that's a theme that council is going to see is whenever we have conversation, there was always work from a previous council, whether it was the immediate last one or 2 councils ago. Like a lot of these plans and policies are based on history, and it is important that we look at policies and update those as they mentioned, that especially now with the 2021 census. It's important that things change, the needs change over time. And then sometimes 20 years from now, they revert back to where they were 20 years ago. I'm thinking of schools when I think of that, some areas are overpopulated and then 20 years later, they become underpopulated. So the needs change, I guess is my main message. So we have to be willing to look at what does that mean in policy? And it is important to do it through policy, so it's not on the backs of applications, because that's not fair when an applicant comes before council and expects that they've complied with everything. And at the 11th hour, we say, oh, well, we'd rather see this, which speaks to the EV parking, the storage, the 3 bedrooms. So I think it is important that we set it through policy and the strategic plan. So really appreciate your report. As always, you do an exceptional job. You always come very prepared, give us lots of information, and are always willing to answer questions and be able to look at new opportunities. So thank you to the planning staff, and in particular to you for your presentation.
Councillor Dode.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I want to actually register my deepest appreciation of what work the staff has done, have done on this particular subject, because it's a subject matter that I'm personally interested in. And what had always bugged me was whether we can get enough information at hand to make decisions and move forward. But reviewing this document actually alleviated that fear. And it also emboldens me to say that it looks like we have quite some capable hands at the City Hall, staff-wise, that can help us move forward. So, Mr. Chairman, my opinion will be that even given the information we have and the possibilities of updating them as they have suggested, she has suggested in this report, I am only excited, waiting for the opportunity for us to establish the direction we want to go, and then let staff come up, because like I said, I believe we have very good heads over there that can provide us all the information we need, especially given what I have read here, because I have never been exposed to this kind of information. I must say this, I have looked at some of the cities and so on. The level of dexterity that was displayed here gives me that courage to say that all we need to do is to establish the direction where we want to go, and we throw it at these guys, they will come up with the compass. And therefore, Mr. Chairman, I want to register again, just like each and every one of us have done, my gratitude to staff for doing a fabulous work, and look forward to coming up with the direction we want to go. And I would rather say that we get it started right now, because time is of essence, because the more we talk about these things and don't move forward, the more some people are still in the street, and we need to do something for our people. And I want to again say thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and thank you to staff for doing such a wonderful job.
Thank you. Councillor Carreras.
Thank you. And just a quick question around the provincial legislation piece, because as you mentioned, there's some big pieces that have come down provincially that will impact us. Are you able to go back to the slide that lists the bills? Sorry, if it's or is it somewhere in the package and you could give me a page?
It is in the
Oh,
report.
there.
Yeah.
I think it's the Housing Supply Act, Bill 43. One of the pieces of legislation that came down last week that you said you're still looking for information on, looks like the province is sort of doing a better job of supporting cities with the pieces. So that was good news. But the Housing Supply Act is one that I'm curious if you guys have had a chance to delve into, because I believe that's the one that says that those housing needs reports become our targets. And if we're not meeting those targets, then the province steps in and tells us how we need to meet those targets. My goal is not, my goal is to work with people to meet those goals. But do we have any more information yet around any dates or requirements when that housing report is needed? And I'm just looking for more information on how we're working together on this.
Through the chair, there's a couple pieces to that. We know the Housing Supply Act, was approved, gone through legislation, but it is quite clear that it's going to be enacted by regulation. So we have not yet seen that document. When we have that, or if we have an idea of where that regulation is going to go, it'll give us a much stronger idea. It does seem to be building on the housing needs regulation that came into effect in 2019. And not necessarily that this is what the province is going to be looking at, but when we did pull a number of approved housing units, it was certainly heartening to see that we are on track and in fact are exceeding our expectations for, I believe, the housing targets for 2026. And at this point, we've approved enough units to qualify for 2025, and it's only 2023. So we've got some time to kind of see and adjust that so that the units that we're bringing forward are certainly aligning with what you would like to see in terms of type and unit choice. But it seems like we're going in the right direction in terms of being able to work with the province through that piece of regulation as opposed to not.
Thanks. And just through to the mayor, just a heads up that this will, obviously for me, any way we can advocate with the new Minister of Housing, Minister Kahlon, to meet with him, whether it's through UBCM, which is so far away, or earlier, I would be happy to any opportunity to have those conversations with the minister and hear the direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any final questions? Councillor Schiller?
Thank you very much. And please bear with me. I don't have the same grasp on housing policy as some of my colleagues. Could you just give me just a bit of a explanation just around the idea of density bonusing? I just want to make sure at this point that I'm sort of clear on really what it is and why we have it. Another simple question for you, Amanda.
Clarity is going to be questionable, but in the zoning bylaw, zones set out how much density is permitted per lot. It's expressed in our zoning bylaw primarily as floor space ratio, FSR. So for example, in our townhouse form in RM1, the base density is 0.6. So any developer who's wishing to rezone a property to an RM1 is permitted outright going up to 0.6, subject to all the other requirements of the zone. So lot coverage, permeability requirements, etc. So where density bonus comes in is that we say, there's a couple of different threads, but so for argument's sake, we'll say the density bonus permits 0.75. So they're going to be able to get a certain number of units in addition to whatever was permitted outright. But in order to do that, we take the square footage of those units, multiply it by the rate that you saw on the screen, and then they pay us cash. And then they are allowed to construct up to that 0.75 or whatever the number of units is sort of how density bonus works in a nutshell. The other element I would just note is our density bonus requirement is citywide, but it is certainly targeted to particular areas, namely area plans, as well as our major corridors. So it isn't to say that all zones bonus at this point in time. Ideally, we are trying to get that additional density in certain hubs or certain nodes that overlay with our transit and our strategic transportation plan. So not all townhouses would be able to do that, but those that meet the requirements would be able to pay the privilege to have a couple of extra units. Depending on the size, oftentimes the smaller developments, you're looking at maybe 1 or 2 additional units. When we start to be larger lot consolidation, it could be looking 10, 20 additional units. So it really does depend on the size of the development in terms of how many additional units that we are able to get.
Thank you. And so those funds collected, then that goes into the community amenity contribution fund?
It goes into a separate fund, the Affordable Housing Reserve Fund.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And just a final question, and forgive me if this is in the many, many pages of information that were provided, but do we have sort of either a target number or like a percentage of like housing units that we would want to see, like ideally being rental, either market or non-market rental versus private ownership? Do we sort of have a goal number that it makes sense for a community to have 30% rentals, or I'm just using very random numbers, but I'm just wondering if such a number exists.
Through the chair, at this point in time, we don't have rental targets from a community from a community perspective. We've had conversation in the past about larger developments having a certain set at a particular target rate, so affordable units, below market rental But I think an important element to note when we're looking at that high level policy perspective is we have private ownership for sure, but of course, private ownership does lend itself to this, what's called the secondary rental market. So it's not necessarily covered, like it's not necessarily affordable housing in the sense in that there's been financing provided by a senior partner, a senior level of government, but it is a unit that is rented out and is available for those to rent. So there's multiple layers when it comes down to looking at rental. And there has been some conversation at the region breaking down what constitutes as affordable rental versus secondary rental and then private ownership. We do have some rough data in that area that I'd be happy to bring back with the housing needs report update to give you a bit of a better look at what that is, in 2022. At this point in time, our policies are really just, we are open for private ownership, we are open for rental. It really depends on who's coming through a development application and what they would like to do in the community.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
Thank you. Any further questions? No, well, then I will add my 2 cents to this. First of all, thank you for your presentation. Very knowledgeable, lots of information to unpack here. I think the challenge as a council, and Councillor Dewitt was actually quite bang on, is councils build on previous councils, right? So we know there's a housing crisis that's going on, and we're all eager to get our hands in there and rip things apart and make things happen. But the way to do that first, and this is why we have this briefing, and it'll lead into the strategy sessions, is it's through policy. When you have a strong policy, that allows things to move faster. That allows developers to know what it is that they're doing, what's required of them. So our role is to look at this policy that's in front of us and ask ourselves, what do we need to do to tweak it? I don't think we need to burn it down. So what's missing from that? And that's part of the conversation that we're going to continue to have. So it's so important that we have information in order to make great decisions and for everybody involved. So I just want to say thank you for council for asking some really good questions. Thank you to staff for being prepared and being very upfront and forthright with your answers. We appreciate it. And I think as we move forward, it'll help us build a better city. Being did you?
Can I?
Sure you can.
I don't have a green card. Just very briefly, this has been great hearing where council is intending to go, and I appreciate there's more strategic conversations coming. But I think in order for staff to be prepared to be able to have that information available for you the next time we meet on this matter, I will say we'll begin taking a look at what those housing needs numbers can be, as well as preparing what we call an options report, kind of outlining some of the pros and cons and background information on a number of the initiatives that you've mentioned today, as well as probably, keeping an ear out as to what types of conversations you're having on the council floor and kind of feed all of that back, and we'll have it ready to go next time we're here.
Thank you. Well said. Seeing how there's no further questions and no further discussion, I will call it. We are adjourned until 11 o'clock.